Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is, I think, one of the more interesting episodes because I'm going to be talking about the Jungian shadow. Um, Shadow is sometimes associated with id. I really dislike that notion, even though there's definitely some overlap. I think if people draw the association between like a Freudian id and the shadow, it's going to lead to more misunderstandings. Because the shadow is really it's definitely the unconscious. In fact, I would argue that it's bigger than the Freudian unconscious, and certainly bigger than the id. Um, it really has all the things about you that you're not particularly fond of, and that includes everything negative, everything. The things that make you nervous, the things that you're afraid of, the things that you believe to be true but are at odds with other things that you know or accept to be true. Things of that sort. And that in and of itself doesn't make it negative. It's the things that we don't particularly like about ourselves. And think about instances where somebody just doesn't mesh with you at all. And someone else who likes that person says, well, it's because you two are just alike. And that really sets you off. It really aggravates you, that idea. The shadow definitely can overlap tremendously with that, with the things that we don't particularly like about ourselves. But that doesn't make the shadow a bad thing, nor does it make it an inherently good thing. It's much more complex and nuanced. It definitely doesn't fall into the black and white good versus evil archetype that a lot of thought systems in modernity apply. But it also doesn't necessarily make it um, in any way more quote unquote creative. A lot of people associate it with creativity, but more creative or useful than the rest of a person's personality. Um, I always think when I think of the shadow, and by the way, I have not read any of Jordan Peterson's stuff, but I had a conversation with someone not too long ago, and they immediately assumed as much. And that this is neither a criticism nor anything positive. This is me being neutral about Jordan Peterson, but apparently he also drew this parallels. Why I'm mentioning it, and that is the Peter Pan, because Peter Pan is incomplete without his shadow, and he desperately wants it. And conversely, Peter Pan's shadow is an utterly impotent thing without the boy attached to it. So, his chief goal early on in the story, when he meets Wendy, is to become united with his shadow, and that's a huge part of uh, the Jungian philosophy. This idea that if you can acclimate and accept aspects of your unconscious mind, especially the things you don't particularly like about yourself, and actually make use of them rather than deny them and assimilate with them, that's a significantly better way of being. It's a better mode of being, because what you're doing is you're taking things about yourself that are inherent that you can't really change all that much. I mean, some things you can, but you're actually making use of them. You're taking things that you don't particularly like, or things that you're concerned about, and you're making it work. You're making it work for you rather than against you. And we see this all the time with people with, you know, crippling anxieties who make use of that, either in their career or the process of overcoming it, reaching some sort of huge revelation about themselves and what really makes them happy. We see this doubly so in terms of someone living their life for other people, completely denying the things that they want because they view them as negative. And that's another great example of the shadow not being a really negative thing, just being perceived that way by the individual. Maybe they want to, I don't know, paint pictures of lighthouses or something. But instead they're an accountant because their parents would be happy with them as an accountant, and their wife is happy with them as an accountant. And then they get terminal cancer. And now none of the things that they've been doing, that they've been suppressing, matter. Now the real self with a capital S becomes more important because they realize they're on borrowed time. And what happens? They move to the bay and they start painting lighthouses, and they stop taking calls from the toxic components of their life, and they've never been happier, and everybody thinks it's weird. Like all their friends and family are like, you should be really upset. Like, why? If I got a diagnosis like that, but they're really happy because they're living for themselves for once. That's a really dramatic example of someone assimilating with their shadow. They've really united with the things about their life that they're uncomfortable with, largely because they realize they don't have to live with their shadow. They don't have to live much longer, so they make peace with that. And there are fewer stories more inspiring than when that happens and then they get better. But the life lesson that they were taught by death, and I can't think of a much better symbol for the shadow than death, if you think about it. The lesson they're taught is still made use of and follows them for the rest of their life, however long that might end up actually being. So this notion of a need to assimilate with your shadow or to accept the darker components of your being, and by which I mean, again, not negative components necessarily, but things that you don't particularly like the world to see. It is important, and it doesn't necessarily mean embracing things that are inherently bad or justifying things that are bad. It's in many ways, it's really fascinating to see the things that people can consider bad and don't. Like there are so many people who have abrasive personalities who insist that they don't need to learn how to be more personable because that's just who they are. But that same person, in a moment of vulnerability, will be ashamed or mortified by the idea of showing that they have any kind of vulnerability. Well, think about that for a minute. Being a dick is something they identify with, and then being vulnerable is their shadow. That happens a lot, where people, sometimes the most admirable or enjoyed thing about a person to society, to the public sphere, to the people that are around, is something that they identify with negatively. And conversely, sometimes the trait that people just tolerate in that person is something they identify with completely on a conscious level. It's what they want to be. And lastly, the last thing I'm going to talk about with regard to the shadow, I think it's a fun thing to do, to consider, at least. This is all hypothetical. If it makes you nervous, don't do it. But maybe it should make you nervous. And that is, think about what it would take for you to not assimilate with your shadow or accept your shadow, but to become your shadow. I think about that often. Like, I'm a law-abiding person. I don't hurt people. People think I'm nice and friendly. What would it take for me to just completely go off? Like, not be me anymore, but be someone else. And sorry about that, mustache hair. I think that this is something we're absolutely fascinated with, especially with regard to men, because men inherently want to protect women and children, and to a lesser extent, other men in their lives. They want to protect. And so what happens when the potential to do so gets taken away and they're left to be just a completely destructive force? And we see this constantly in movies, particularly revenge stories, particularly every movie that Mel Gibson has ever been in. It's kind of amazing. A guy is nice and peaceful and everything's fine, and then he loses everything. And then, because they can't seek any help from society for insert corrupt reason here, they just become horrible, irredeemable. They become their own darkest view of themselves. Walter White, Batman, which Batman still has a lot of principles, but early on he didn't in the old 40s comics. These are really good examples because these are people who have nothing to be the positive view of themselves left. The idea of being ego or self or soul, it's gone. There's no point. So they become a reflection of that. It's really amazing to see. I can't think of a more fun and modern example than Walter White, because he kind of takes what I was talking about before, assimilation of the shadow, in light of a brush with death, facing your own mortality, and completely subverts it. He goes full headlong into becoming his shadow, not assimilating with it, becoming the darkest version of himself. And it's a really fascinating little transformation to watch. Well, similarly, I'm almost positing this as a question to you guys. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about what would happen if you were, let's say, falsely accused of the worst crime imaginable, and your family disowns you, and you lose everything, and everybody hates you, and you go to jail, and you get mistreated and shanked, and it's awful, and then just one random day you're vindicated, like evidence vindicates you? Would you imagine yourself just going back to the way things are, or would you imagine yourself being a completely different person? Would you just completely, I would say, consumed by hate at that point? That is in my opinion, like that hypothetical to play with. Like, what would it take to really, just ruin your life? What would it take to just ruin your life forever? Like, where you're just going to do whatever you're going to do. We see this. A great example in real life would be Bonnie and Clyde. This was a case where, once he got a taste and she got a taste for doing this, they just started killing and robbing people. And it's not like there was any going back. And that's what I mean, becoming your shadow rather than assimilating. Assimilating is a good thing. Becoming, what does it take for you to just reach a point of no return where you're like, I'm not going to be the me I was anymore. I don't have anything to live for regarding the old me anymore. I'm going to be something else. I'm going to be something destructive. I'm going to be all the negative things that I didn't like about me. And that's all I'm going to be. I mean, just a complete inversion. All the positives are now under the surface, and all the negatives are above the surface. I think that's a fun thing to sort of meditate on. Like, what would it take for you to not be that? Because I think we've all seen that. I think we've all seen news stories where we're like, oh, wow, that guy was just me, except he had a really bad day. It happens. And it's one of the reasons why we're so fascinated with film archetypes that showcase this. It's one of the reasons why anti-heroes have these little popular spat periods. Early 2000s was big on that, anti-heroes. It's why the Joker movie sold so well, and also why the media really hammed up like why they were so scared that it sold so well. So it's just something to contemplate. The components that constitute your shadow, the best way to assimilate with it, the more destructive ways that you deny it, and then of course the nightmarish scenario of you becoming it. I think that's what everyone's sort of afraid of, more so than anything else, in their heart of hearts. Is not dying. It's not experiencing trauma. It's the subsequent becoming your shadow in light of facing that trauma. I also really like, this is a little more non sequitur, but I really like that Freud, I've got that on the brain, Freudian slip with the name Freud, huh? I really like that Jung used alchemy as a metaphor for a lot of these things. For example, Negrito in alchemy is what he used to exemplify the shadow. Well, I like that a lot more. I swear this is the last mean thing I'm going to say about Freud today. I like that a lot more, alchemy, because it's very useful and very easy to put categories into alchemy than what Freud did, which was flipping Greek drama. I mean, like, I think about some of the things he talks about, like, that are such a stretch because he sort of shoehorned it into Greek drama categories, that when you use alchemy, I mean, you don't have to stretch anything because it's a very stretchy material already. So yeah, that's the last time I'll badmouth in this episode, and I really don't mean it to come across as negative as it probably does. Maybe I got a lot in common with him, and that's why. Maybe that's some of that shadow work I need to do. But like, share, subscribe, and keep asking questions. Bye.